All right, wonderful. So thank you very much for the opportunity to chat today, and thank you all for coming along and having a listen. So Resilient South is one of 11 climate partnerships that was established to deliver practical actions to strengthen the climate resilience of their communities, economies, and the natural and built environments. So Resilient South is a partnership between the cities of Holdfast Bay, the City of Marion, City of Mitcham, and the City of Onkaparinga, and the state government. And the idea is that by working as a region, councils have the capacity to effect more change and to be more effective at gaining funds, influencing the state and Commonwealth governments, and working with our community. Because for most people, climate change doesn't stop at the council border, and they may work in one area and live in another. So we're trying to have as regional approach as we can. By operating as a partnership, we can also lend on each other's strengths and really start to federate to work on critical issues. Each of those councils has their own priorities, of course. Holdfast Bay and Mitcham are comparatively small councils that have a smaller revenue base than Onkaparinga and Marion. But Mitcham and Onkaparinga are a lot more focused on fire than Holdfast Bay and Onkaparinga and Marion, which are more focused on coastal issues. So it allows us to kind of maintain individual identities while sharing resources, and provides a vehicle for projects to proceed without being led by any single council necessarily. So we can share the risk as well. We've also been a very effective funding vehicle. We've had funding from Green Adelaide and the Department for Environment and Water, the SA Fire and Emergency Commissioner, the Local Government Association, and the Commonwealth Government. And that's because partnerships are much more attractive to fund than a single agency. Some of our key activities, including supporting the community through our climate-ready schools, community arts exchange, and our heatwave hypothetical. Collecting data, such as through our urban heat mapping, tree canopy, and coastal erosion data, which I'll talk about in a bit. Advocacy, such as coordinating council input to bodies such as state government and utility providers. And we've expanded into emissions reduction, including through LED street lighting and electric vehicle infrastructure. And by operating as a region, we've been able to get funding for a central coordinator, that's me, which is funded by the state government. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but this is what we've been told climate change will look like, and this is what we're seeing. This isn't just a down the track kind of thing. This is what we're already starting to see, the trajectory that we're on. And there's more than just this, but these are the climate impacts that are most relevant to trees, which are going to be what I talk about most today. And trees I'm talking about for two reasons. One, it's my area of interest and expertise, and secondly, because trees are really a no regrets action. A lot of what we talk about in terms of climate change investments, people talk about, well, that might be wasted investment. Are we doing the right thing? Is this the most important thing? Trees are a no regrets option. They're certainly not going to cause us any harm. These changes are, of course, likely to accelerate, and we're currently tracking to the RCP 8.5 scenario, which was previously classified as extreme, but now appears to be the most likely. We are bending the curve, but not nearly enough. Of major concern to the urban forest are these drying and warming trends. Adelaide is getting chronically hotter and drier. Our temperatures are slowly creeping up, and we're experiencing less rainfall overall. And this is what we tend to think about a lot with climate change, these chronic effects. If we have a look at the number of days over 42 degrees centigrade that have occurred each decade, in the last 20 years, we've seen a huge spike, and that's projected to continue. And so we're going to have these acute events as well, where we have heat waves and droughts that are really going to be associated with huge stress on all of our native systems and ourselves. Public health is a huge part of this as well. But these have the capacity to really cause problems for our trees. I'd also point out this less rain, but more intense storms and flooding. More intense storms and flooding is the kind of thing that we've seen for the past couple of weeks up here, and anyone who's been driving around this neck of the woods, as I imagine you all have, has seen huge damage that's been caused by the storms that we've seen. That's likely to continue. Next slide, please. So why are trees important in climate change? Who's familiar with the urban heat island effect? Give me a show of hands. A few of you, about half. So this is the idea that paved surfaces absorb heat during the day. Sun shines on them, they suck up that heat, and then when the sun goes down, they continue to they start to radiate it back out, and that warms our environment, and it continues to do so throughout the night. And then the next day, the heat picks up again, and so it means that our suburbs don't cool down; they stay hotter during the day and hotter overnight, which is obviously makes it harder to get to sleep. And is a bigger stress for all of our native systems as well. And we can really measure that. We can see that in really built-up areas, it will be several degrees warmer than in suburban residential areas where there are more green spaces and less impermeable surfaces, which is even hotter than the surrounding peri-urban and rural areas. We can measure this too using infrared thermography from a plane, and I'll show you that shortly. This is what that looks like in reality. So this is where we are now. So we are in the Blackwood Uniting Church, which is here. There's the main Blackwood roundabout there. And this is what that looks like when we look at that through a thermal imaging camera. Here's the roundabout, and this big red spot is the church that we're in at the moment, one of the hottest places that you could be on a hot day. And that's because there are no trees that are overhanging this building. You can see, though, if we look over on Station Road, where we've got this nice big belt of trees, this is one of the coolest places that you could be on a hot day. Now, that you will have also noticed these blue spots and might think that they're lovely places to be. They probably would be, but the reason that they're nice and blue is because they're a lot cooler than their surrounding environments because they have leaky air conditioning. These are houses and shops largely that are basically not sealed properly, and so all of the air conditioning that they have on is leaking into the surrounding environment, so they're spending a lot of money to cool the outside. Next slide, please. Trees are also super cool because they shade a lot more effectively than other structures. This tree on the left, it's an oak. The shade that is cast by that oak is about 10 degrees cooler than from any other structure, like this shade sail on the right. And that's because trees transpire. They lose moisture from their leaves. That has an evaporative cooling effect, so they are much cooler than other structures. And this means that if we plant trees, rather than having other shade structures, we're a lot cooler. Next slide, please. They're also critical for our biodiversity. The yellow-tailed black cockatoo there on the left relies on a dwindling number of food trees. It also needs tall trees for surveillance and nesting. On the right, we have the grey-headed flying foxes. A colony has sprung up in the last few years in Botanic Park, and they're climate refugees from the East Coast. The climatic conditions are not as suitable as they were over there. They're not much better here. But we've planted large East Coast species and fruiting species that have created an environment that is suitable for those species. And in order to be able to keep them here, we need to maintain a tree canopy that's suitable for them, and indeed our native species. Next one, please. Next one as well, please. No, sorry, back one. Too far. Thank you. Also, air quality, stormwater management. This is the idea of making sure that our footpaths and our roads aren't washed away because trees tend to retard surface water where it sits and suck that water up. And this one is increased human health. There is a huge link between human health, gut health, respiratory health and psychological health, decreased crime rates and areas of high trees. And this has been found in several scientific publications. More are coming out all the time. So it's not only in our comfort, in the interest of our comfort, but also in our public health to have a green and leafy city. So how are we going? What does Adelaide look like? The 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide was updated in 2017, and it established that we had a baseline canopy of 27.28% canopy, which means that if you drop a pin out of a plane somewhere over Adelaide, stick that pin in a map, then there is a roughly 25% chance that you will hit a tree. That's not too bad, but it's certainly not where we want to be. We would like to be up into the 30s. City of Mitcham, sorry, next slide. The City of Mitcham is blessed with an urban canopy which is the highest in Adelaide. It's the highest local government area with just under 50% of Mitcham under tree canopy. And before we all feel too smug about that, that's largely because we have some really large park areas. We have Belair National Park, we have Brownhill Creek, you know, some large rural properties that have very high canopy compared to some of the more built-up areas of Adelaide. And the target under the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide is that we will increase our canopy from 20%, from that 27% baseline, by 2045. So we don't actually have too much time to go. If we look at some of the other councils in Adelaide, this is Port Adelaide Enfield, they're sitting at 9.9%. So much fewer trees in Port Adelaide Enfield. Partly that's to do with rainfall, because there's not quite so much rain out at the port, but certainly it's largely to do with clearing as well, and that it hasn't been such a priority. There is, even within these local government areas though, there is a huge discrepancy, huge unevenness in where trees sit. We have suburbs in the south that have coverage well below 5%, and that's often correlated with poorer suburbs. So suburbs that have lower socioeconomic status tend to have the fewest trees, and these are the households that probably need them the most. These are the houses that possibly will have the highest energy bills because they don't have as good insulation, they don't have solar panels, and they are the most at risk if their power were to go out or they weren't able to pay their power bills because they're getting so high. Next slide, please. And it looks like we're going backwards. So that's 27% in 2017. We haven't yet done a repeat flyover. Well, we have done the flyover, but we're still waiting on the data. That was done earlier this year. But the incidental, the data that we have looking at aerial photography from near maps and others suggests that we're going backwards. That's largely due to the removal of trees on private land, and I'll talk to you about why that's the case in a minute. Next slide. So back to climate change. How does climate impact the trees that we do have? Both heat waves and droughts have the potential to lead to widespread street tree death. And it's useful to understand how transpiration in trees works to understand this. So trees are a little bit like those diffuser sticks that you can buy in posh homeware shops. They suck up moisture from their surface roots, which are largely in the top 30 centimetres of the soil. You know, most tree roots are not sucking up water from the deep; they're sucking up water from the surface. So they suck up water from the surface. They take that up through their stem, and then they transpire it in their leaves. So that water transport up through the stem into the leaves carries nutrients and nutrients from the roots, and then pores in the leaves are the conduit through which that water evaporates into the surrounding environment. If we drought a tree, it has a choice. It can shut down those pores and hold on to the moisture, but then it will start to starve, and eventually it will be pushed beyond its capacity to continue functioning, and it will need to open those pores and it will dehydrate. Trees can also have moisture evaporating directly through their leaves outside of the pores, and so if it gets hot and dry enough, then they'll die very quickly. So with this choice between either starving or dehydrating, eventually, if they don't have enough water coming in from the surface, they'll get an air embolism, which acts a lot like a stroke would in a human, and part of the crown or the entire crown dies. This is one of the major factors in trees dropping their limbs, leaves in times of stress, but it's also the same factor that causes eucalypts to drop their limbs. So this idea of sudden limb drop in eucalypts, that eucalypts can suddenly just drop a branch, it's not really sudden at all. It happens in times of stress, and if you observe a tree, you can actually predict it happening quite well. So I've talked a bit about the acute effects. Chronic effects will also lead to a slow decline in established tree health as they move outside their climatic range. Some species will see increasingly sparse canopy, limb drop and susceptibility to disease, and the inability to establish new trees. So these are a couple of trees that you might recognise from Main Street in Blackwood. You can see they have really sparse canopies. These trees for about the past year have been looking increasingly sparse, and I think that they're on the way out. I don't think they'll recover. These are native species, you know, they're not introduced species from the Northern Hemisphere or anything like that. This is us starting to lose our native vegetation in a built-up environment. Another thing that we're starting to see is a lack of ability to establish new street trees. So in my 4 councils, we have planted about 15,000 street trees in the last year, and increasingly we're starting to have trouble getting them going. You know, we put these trees in the ground, we water them, a few days of hot weather comes along, knocks them on the head, we have to come and replace them later. It's a real shame. But heat wave and drought effects are really likely to see the loss of large cohorts of trees, particularly as those heat waves increase with climate change projections. And both of these changes, the chronic and the acute effects, are likely to occur a lot more suddenly than people realise. Both are already observable in Adelaide. They can also act together and cause an increased susceptibility of pathogens that can also be mobilised by changing climate patterns. So a combination of stresses is what's leading to the dieback of the stringybarks in the Adelaide Hills, which many of you might have seen as you drive up the freeway or through the roads in the hills. And a paper's recently come out that's describing that. Next picture. This is also something that we're starting to see. This has not typically been a big problem in Adelaide before. This is a root plate failure. And so this is not a tree, you know, just snapping off in a high wind or something like that. This is the soil becoming saturated and the roots of that tree losing cohesion with the surrounding soil, and then a strong gust of wind blowing that tree over. And the reason that we haven't seen it a lot before is because we tend to be quite a dry state. But as we start to have these big dumps of rainfall which saturate the soil, and these higher winds, as we expect in these big storm surges, we're starting to see this more. And this happened a lot in the last couple of weeks. You can see that I drive through Blackwood a bit because pretty much all of these photos have been taken in Blackwood. Thank you. So if we have a bit of a look at Adelaide's urban forest, this is basically what it looks like. I've been doing some work through the University of Adelaide recently where we have collected data from the 20 councils that make up Greater Adelaide, and we've established a database of about 500,000 street trees, and this is what that diversity looks like. These are, in order, the most dominant species that we have in the Adelaide urban forest. And these 6 species here represent more than a third of our street trees. There's a really strong reliance on known or proven species, some of which we know are unlikely to cope well with hotter and drier conditions. And I'm talking here particularly about the Northern Hemisphere deciduous species, like plane trees and elms. This is a problem in times of stress, this lack of diversity, because we know that some of these trees are at the edge of their climatic tolerance, and many of the others are really closely related. So one family, the Myrtaceae, which is the gum trees, the callistemons, the bottle brushes, these kind of species, which is dominant in Australia, represents 6 out of the 10 top species. And because these species are really closely related, it means that they have the ability to be affected in the same way. We're putting all of our eggs in one basket. And particularly with threats like myrtle rust and Phytophthora, that have the potential to become a lot more virulent under climate change, we could lose some of these trees, large parts of our urban forest, quite quickly. This is an issue that's been identified interstate as well. So City of Melbourne, in its urban forest strategy, has identified that if it does not diversify its canopy, it predicts to lose 44% of its trees in the next 20 years. That is a huge number of trees. And so in response to that, they've said, okay, we really need to focus on increasing the diversity of the trees that we're planting. No more than 5% of any one species, and no more than 20% of any one family. We're sitting much, much higher than that in both species and family diversity. So we've got a lot of work to do. I should also say that diversity is not very even either. Some suburbs have quite a lot of diversity of street trees, but some suburbs have a really strong characterisation, are really characterised by 1 or 2 species. So you imagine the streets that you drive through in Adelaide that are full of jacarandas or are full of bottle brushes. These areas are really much more vulnerable than those that have a mix of different street tree species. Infrastructure. Trees are also a major threat to infrastructure. This year, South Australia's power networks, SA Power Networks, spent more than $42 million on vegetation clearance. This is pruning around power lines, and it's their biggest single expense. About $8.4 million of that was in the low bushfire zones. The vast majority was in bushfire zones, though. SA Water spent more than $5 million on pipe chokes. This is where roots invade one of their pipes that they need to come and fix. And utilities are really seeking to reduce that operational expenditure. They want to make sure that they're not spending any more money than they have to, because in many cases they then pass that on to their customers in the form of higher water and power bills. In addition to infrastructure damage, we're also seeing a lot of really heavily pruned trees in some areas. Those trees have lost a lot of their environmental and amenity value. And again, up here in the Mitcham Hills, you see a lot of trees that look like this. And the grey boxes that are along Main Street are a classic example of that. They've lost a lot of their amenity value and their environmental value. As a consequence of this, the utilities providers have lobbied the state government to place a number of restrictions on the trees that can be planted in proximity to their infrastructure. So under power lines, there is a list of 272 species that can be planted, and within 2 metres of SA water pipes or wastewater, there are 219 tree species that can be planted. And that sounds like quite a lot. You know, that's quite a lot of tree species. But I've been generous here on what I'm calling a tree. A lot of these species are probably my height, so probably more shrubs than trees, and several of them have characteristics that would make them unsuitable as street trees. So they might be poisonous, or they might be spiky, or they might not allow a line of sight for traffic, or these kind of concerns. But one of the biggest problems is that when we look at the combination of what you can plant under both a power line and under a water pipe, there are only 62. So when we start to layer on then the availability of these species, what soil type they grow in, your local government arborists actually have very little flexibility in what they plant at all. And most of those 62 species would have something problematic about them. And utilities can and do issue non-compliance notices to local governments to remove non-compliant trees in the vicinity of their infrastructure. So to recap that, the limitations we have to canopy growth are climate change, both chronic and acute, utility restrictions, mainly on private land, and then the removal of trees, mainly on private land. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now. So what can we do about this? How can we get a bit better outcome? I've worked at all 3 levels of government in my career, and I've learned that really to drive effective change, you need 3 things. You need regulation, you need rules that people can follow, you need support from the community and economic incentive, support from the community, everyone has to get behind what you're saying, and you need economic incentive, or the lack of incentive to do the wrong thing. And if you don't have each of those legs of the stool in place, then your trees aren't going to thrive. So who attended Joe and Tom's talk before? A few of you? Wonderful. They would have talked about this report that they wrote on the left. So this is the comparison of Australia's tree laws that they published last year, and that compared South Australia's tree protection laws to those interstate, and it found them wanting. The state government was a bit concerned about all the press that got, and asked my team at the University of Adelaide to review the findings of that report and see whether they were correct. So we surveyed 101 local governments in capital cities across Australia to see how they protect their trees. And I'll take you through the sort of Cliff Notes versions of our finding, but you're welcome to download the report from the State Planning Commission website. So of the 101 councils that we looked at, roughly 2/3 of them used at least one size-based protection for trees. They said we're going to protect trees based on their size in some way. About half of them said we're going to protect a tree once it reaches a certain height. About half said we're going to protect a tree once it reaches a certain trunk circumference. And about a fifth said we're going to protect them based on crown spread. This is important because these different methods are important because they will target different trees. In South Australia, we have a 2 metre stem circumference measure that we use, but some species like grey box are unlikely to ever reach that because they just don't get that big. And the most powerful approach is probably to use a combination of these. So if we have a look at circumference, first of all, about 78% of the councils that we looked at, thank you, had a 50 metre circumference, 50 metres or smaller. 50 centimetres is about that big. We're not talking about big trees. By the time we get to 1 metre, thank you, 95% of councils. There was one council that had 140 centimetre circumference, and South Australia sits out here at 2 metres. So this is not a South Australia is much less restrictive than most local governments in the state. This is really easy to measure, by the way. It's just done with a measuring tape around the trunk, as you can see there on the bottom left. Then if we turn to height, this was the most popular way of protecting trees interstate. Just over half of councils use this. It's a little bit trickier to measure. Measuring tree height, ideally you need a laser rangefinder, but you can certainly estimate it, particularly for smaller trees. So for example, power lines are usually at 8 metres, so you can, and a single-storey house is about 5 metres high, so it's reasonably easy to compare it to those kind of structures. We don't use this at all in South Australia. We don't protect trees based on height. And the other dimensional-based protection was crown spread. And about 20% of the councils that we looked at protected based on crown spread. We don't do this at all in South Australia. The average of the councils interstate was 3.5 metres, which is probably about is probably about from me to the wall away, maybe a bit less than that. So again, not a particularly large crown tree. And you can measure that by pacing it out on the ground, but it's really easy with a tool like Google Maps. And one of the nice things about this method is that you don't need to go onto the land to measure it, which makes it really attractive for local governments because they can just hop on some aerial imagery and they can see whether a tree is protected or not. It's also a huge benefit for planners and developers. One thing about this method though, thank you, is that it can change with pruning and seasonally, so it's probably best combined with one of the other dimensional protections to make sure that it can't just be changed with a bit of pruning or based on the season that it's done in. So if we now have a look at the distance exemptions, so under the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act in South Australia, every house and swimming pool generates a 10-metre radius at which any tree protections are removed. So that means that in this hypothetical house that I've drawn, that house and the swimming pool, any 10 metres away from that, a tree cannot be protected, and that homeowner can come in whenever they like and remove those trees, as could a developer or anyone else. So if we compare that to the situation interstate, this is a minority of councils interstate where they say a house will generate a 2 or 3 metre buffer rather than a 10 metre buffer. Swimming pools don't count, sheds don't count, it's got to be a house or other substantial structure. This is a minority of councils. This is about 20% of councils. Then if we look at the majority of councils interstate, houses don't generate any protected buffer at all. So they say, if you want to remove a tree because it's interfering with a house, you need to demonstrate that. You need to get an engineer's report, you need to have some kind of evidence that shows that that tree is interfering with the, is undermining a structure in order to remove it. And what that means is that in both of these situations that exist interstate, most of these trees will be retained as protected. And this is a nice big block, but probably not with a big enough frontage for subdivision. But you know, this gives you an idea of a typical kind of scenario. And effectively what this means is that in Adelaide, only a tiny proportion of most housing blocks are able to support truly protected trees. And we'll see what that looks like in reality rather than in my quick diagram shortly. Okay, species exemptions. Nearly every jurisdiction that we looked at interstate exempts some species from protection on the basis that they are weeds or they are ugly or people hate them for some reason. This is the list of species that we exempt in South Australia. Most of these are weeds, but Every one of those species will have its defenders, and in some circumstances, particularly in gardens, each has the capacity to be a high-value tree. I had a lady, I'm not sure if she's in the room now, who came and talked to me before about how she thought ash trees were awful because they get into creeks and they cause all kinds of problems. Yet ash trees are one of our most popular street trees in Adelaide, and they perform very well as street trees. So certainly something that you need to consider where you plant it, but in some situations it's definitely worth protecting. One of the big problems with exempting trees on the basis of their species identity is that trees are actually really hard to identify in some situations. So this tree is a spotted gum. This tree was in Beaumont, and it was the landowner decided that they wanted to remove it. Because it was identified, they hired a professional arborist. The arborist came and identified it as a spotted gum, which is exempt from protection within 10 metres of a house. And so, which you can see that one is, and so that arborist put it through the chipper and removed it. Unfortunately, shortly after this happened, it was identified not as a spotted gum, but as a Sydney blue gum, which was protected. And so that professional arborist's mistake meant that a protected tree was removed. That arborist was fined a grand total of $5,200, which represents less than 5% of the possible penalty that they could have given. And for this reason, I think that species exemption should be used really sparingly in an urban environment. It's probably far more useful outside of the suburbs, you know, when you're dealing with a rural situation, where you're dealing with weeds under the Landscape Act, rather than in a backyard kind of situation. There are a lot of other regulatory protections that I don't have time to go through here, but are detailed in our report. These include planning overlays and location-based protections, the idea that we're going to treat different precincts or neighbourhoods differently in the trees that we protect. Giving additional protections to some species that we really like grey box, for example. Regulating arborists. Anyone in this room can go out and call themselves an arborist tomorrow and start giving arboricultural advice. There's no barrier to you doing that. That's a problem, and that has led to a number of shonky operators in the industry that would be much better regulated. Pruning activity. At the moment, even with a protected tree, you can prune that tree as often as you like, and that can essentially mean that a tree can die a death of 1,000 cuts. Economic instruments, the idea that we might want to have bonds or fees for development matters to do with protected trees. Council regulations, most of the councils that we looked at interstate, their tree protections are done through local laws, council bylaws, not through a state-based planning law, and South Australia is unique in that respect. Tree valuation methodologies, there are a number of ways that we value trees, and they can give you wildly different answers in terms of how much an individual tree is worth, and therefore how much bond or how much penalty might be attracted if you do the wrong thing. Tree protection registers, we have tree protection registers in Adelaide, but they don't really have any legislative force. And penalties. And fines are a big one here. You know, you do something bad and we'll give you a stonking fine to discourage you for that. But there are other types of penalties that can also be very effective. And one that's gained a lot of attention interstate and overseas has been shaming signs. So where a tree has been poisoned, for example, and it's not necessarily immediately clear who might have poisoned that tree, perhaps you might suspect the neighbours who might get a lovely sea view if that tree were to be removed. That tree gets poisoned. Rather than just council coming and removing it, they could put up a big sign that says, someone has poisoned this tree and we're all very upset about it, and we will remove this sign when the trees that we've planted underneath it reach the height of the sign. You only have to do that a few times before it becomes very unappealing for the idea of someone, instead of looking at a tree that might be blocking their view, they look at a big sign that shames them every day, and everyone kind of suspects who took out that tree. So I said that we would look at what this looks like at the ground, on the ground. Maybe just move forward one as well. This is I think this one was on Portrush Road, certainly down the north of the sort of eastern suburbs. So there are two blocks that I draw your attention to here. These two blocks. On the left it's in 2015, on the right it's 7 years later. And you can see that there are two blocks here that have been developed, and they're slowly moving their way down the street. And there are three trees here that I draw your attention to. this one here, this one here, this one here. In each situation, they are probably regulated trees. Can't tell because I wasn't there, I couldn't measure them. But you can see that each one of them is 10 metres from the house. So they had while they were in theory protected, they had an exemption because of their proximity to a house or a swimming pool. But they were also on the boundaries of their properties. So in each of those situations, the developer could have said, I'm going to retain these trees. But in order to make that decision to retain the tree, the developer would have then had to institute a tree protection zone. They would have had to have put up hoardings around that tree, quite a distance from that tree, stopped any traffic moving on the root zone to damage the roots, and it would have been a big pain in the neck for them to protect them, even if they didn't want to build a house on them. And as you can see, it would have been very hard to retain that tree at the bottom there, given the footprint of the houses that have gone in. Not quite sure what's going to go on this one, but probably something pretty similar. So it's a no-brainer. If you're a developer, you say, well, I'd probably want the land to build a house, but even if I don't, I might as well, I'll remove them because it's going to be a lot easier to build those houses when I don't have to worry about protecting the trees. In those situations, those developers would have had to pay about $200 per tree into an offset fund. So, the cost of the trees was pretty minimal. So what that means is that there's a huge economic incentive to remove the trees in that situation. Let's have a look at another one. Thank you again. This is a house up in Blackwood, 2016 to 2018. Nice big corner block. Two big red gums out the front of that house. So as you can see, the developer has taken that one big block and divided that into 3 properties. And there was certainly the opportunity to retain those 2 regulated eucalypts. But once the subdivision occurred, once it was chopped into 3, it was no longer possible because those properties needed driveways. How could we improve this? What kind of laws could we put in place to get a better outcome? Well, if we introduced a tree protection scheme with a bond based on the projected value of the developed land, that might be one way that we could do it. So the private land occupied by those 2 trees, not the bit that's overhanging the road, but just the bit on the private land, is about 20% of the block, which is about 500 square metres. And before the subdivision, the property was valued at about $280 a square metre. If the subdivision meant that the developer was able to increase the value of the land to $560 a square metre, so this land now is worth $560 a square metre before you've even built the houses, just because you can fit 3 houses on there, that means that the value of those trees, the area occupied by those trees, is worth $280,000. So, if council or state government were able to say to that developer, we're going to charge you a fee or a bond of $280,000 in order to retain those trees, the developer would have no incentive to remove the trees. It would make a lot more sense for that developer to say, okay, I'm only going to divide that house, that property into 2, and we're going to have less urban infill, we're going to retain the big trees. It's a lot of money, $280,000, although not out of whack with the tree valuations for large eucalypts. But taking away the economic incentive to the developer to remove the trees would provide an opportunity to retain them. It would also provide an opportunity for government to start to accumulate the amounts of money that are necessary to be able to buy land in other places to retain trees. At the moment, if the council it's council or state government receives $200 or $300 for a large tree to be removed, that's not enough money really to do very much with it all. It costs less money to actually plant a street tree, let alone preserve a large tree somewhere else. So if we talk a little bit about social issues, trees are a nuisance. Sorry, go back. Thank you. Trees are a nuisance, and this is really important to keep in mind because we don't want to be a police state. We don't just want to say, here are all of the rules and you've got to follow the rules because that's how it is. We want to try and address the reasons that people don't want to retain or plant trees. And the reality is they do cause problems. They drop litter on the ground, leaves and gum nuts, in gutters, pools, they drop resin on your car. One of the most common complaints that councils get is that trees, either my neighbour's trees or the street trees, are blocking my solar panels. They lift the pavement. And the nuisance value of trees can be painfully obvious, but the benefits aren't so well understood. And this leads to a really strong NIMBY vibe for trees. NIMBY, not in my backyard, is an idea that we associate really strongly with big infrastructure, you know, things like mobile phone towers and power transformers and power plants and things like that. But it occurs with trees just as much. And there's a really clear role for government to play in educating the public and not providing incentives for perverse outcomes. So if I give you a bit of an example, and we take, thank you, the solar panels as an example. This is one of the biggest complaints that councils get in relation to trees. Typical home solar setup is 5 kilowatts. And yes, it's best installed where there is no shade, but even if there is shade, the feed-in tariff is about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And that means that your solar panels, assuming that they're running at peak efficiency, might make you a few dollars a day. And so that gives you a payback period, assuming that you pay somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 for that setup. It has a payback period of something like 6 years. Along with improving the insulation and energy efficiency of your home, it's one of the best investments that you can make. But that $3 a day that you might be making from your solar panels is only going to reduce as the solar feed-in tariff reduces. And as AEMO starts turning off solar panels, as increased uptake means that they need to start switching off solar panels in order to stop the electricity grid from being overloaded. So what that means is that your solar panels are going to be making you less and less money, and the shade from those trees, which as I've mentioned before, can be up to 10 degrees cooler than any other shade, let alone no shade at all, will mean that you are saving more money in summer than you are losing through lost income from your solar panels. Cooling in summer is about 30 to 40% of the average electricity bill, so any reduction in electricity generated is more than offset by savings in air conditioning, which is then free. Plus we reduce the climate impact of power generation, plus we sequester that carbon through the tree growing. It's really a no-brainer. Fear. Trees are vicious murderers who want to kill you in your bed. Trees cause about 5 deaths per year in Australia. It's a bit hard to estimate because of the difficulty in defining what a tree death is. This includes things like Buggerlugs was climbing a tree and fell out of the tree, that kind of thing. But it's actually a remarkably low figure and evidence of how very stable trees are. You know, I said before that 27% of Adelaide is covered in trees, and the fact that we get five deaths a year shows you that they cause surprisingly few deaths given how ubiquitous they are in our cities. You're about 2 to 3 times more likely to die from a lightning strike, 43 times more likely to die from a violent assault, and about 240 times more likely to die in a car accident. The risks associated with the risk rating of a tree is calculated by an arborist assessment of the tree, but it's not benchmarked against the actual failure rate. So an arborist does an assessment of the tree and says, I think that has a medium chance of failure or a low chance of failure, but we don't go back to the actual data and say there are only 5 deaths a year that are caused by trees, and that work needs to be better quantified. That's progressing at the moment through Arboriculture Australia, the Insurance Council and other players, but definitely a big piece of work that needs to happen so that we can more realistically gauge how risky our trees are. Another thing to keep in mind too is, of course, that trees tend to fall in periods of high stress, which is not usually when people are sitting under them, unless you have a large tree over your house in a storm. That's the one environment where you want to make sure that you're getting that tree regularly assessed to quantify its impact as best you can. Prestige and education. Established trees are really hard to move. You can't go to Bunnings and buy a 100-year-old red gum or oak, and they reflect the history of a house and the community. People tend to want to preserve old houses, but not so much with old trees. I think that there's some work that we could do in turning trees into prestige items, just as you would with architectural features. There's a huge correlation between wealthier suburbs and health, but it's not recognised that that's partly due to greater green spaces. As I mentioned before, there's a direct link between exposure to diverse greenery and better respiratory, gut and psychological health and lower crime rates. Educating people about the value of these trees and busting some of the myths, light trees at shading your solar panels, and sun limb drop in eucalypts will help people value their trees, encourage people to value their trees. Adelaide has spent a lot of money becoming a national park city and has some very passionate tree people in Green Adelaide. So I'd really like to empower them to educate our community about trees. It's a really easy sell. So I was asked to talk a bit about how to reach best practice, and lots of work has been done on trees in the last sort of 20 years. Local governments, state governments, through the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide and Green Adelaide, the universities, NGOs, particularly the Conservation Council in the last couple of years, have produced lots of reports and plans and lobbying positions, and they have basically been produced to help encourage a green, highly livable city. However, they are really overshadowed by a number of, a small number of much more powerful documents. These are state government policy or legislative documents, acts, regulations and directions that impact our urban canopy, and each of these treats trees as a risk. So they say a tree has the ability, is a threat because it could fall on a power line and start a fire or cause an outage, or a tree could invade a sewer pipe and cause a flood, or a tree is a threat to a house, or a tree needs to be cleared from a roadside in order to make sure that there is safe traffic. All of those things are true, by the way, but they solely view trees as a risk. And what they do not do is view trees as a necessary part of our community. They view trees as something that needs to be excluded from the area where our infrastructure is. But as Adelaide has built up and become denser, and land has become more precious, trees are being pushed out of our suburbs. And what we now need to do is start framing trees as a necessary part of that environment and framing these documents around infrastructure as needing to be tolerant of trees. We need to find ways for our infrastructure to coexist with large, shady trees that perform the services that we need. So the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act at the moment is currently under review, and those of you who attended Nina Keith's talk previously would have heard about that. I would really encourage you to hop on the State Planning Commission's website and put your views in as to how we should be developing our city. The Planning Minister, Nick Champion, has already said that he intends to reform our tree protection laws, but the expert panel that is informing the Planning Code review have already said that they will not be making specific recommendations on any tree protection methods, like the size protections or distance exemptions. So it's pretty unclear how state government intends on reforming it. And I would argue that doing it just through the Planning Act is not going to encompass all of the comprehensive protections that we need. I think we need to look at all four of those documents to make sure that we're treating trees consistently and that we can meet the targets in the 30-year plan. So I've given a couple of specific ideas as to how we can improve the rules, but until there's harmonisation between all those documents, we're unlikely to achieve it. So I started off with my talk talking a bit about Resilient South and the work that we do. Trees are a big part of what I do at Resilient South and a big focus for me. We love trees and we're doing good work to diversify and grow our canopy, but it's really only part of what we do. We're also focused on helping individuals and businesses adapt to climate change, providing data on climate and climate risk, identifying ways that people and businesses can reduce their carbon emissions, better manage our community assets, helping teachers integrate climate change into their lessons, and lots of other things. We're currently in the process of developing our new 5-year plan, and we would love to hear about what your priorities are for your community. This is part of the Resilient South region, and we really want to hear about it. So please come up and talk to me with the Resilient South banner. I'm just next to Mitcham and Keysab, and I'd love to hear more about what your priorities are. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks also to the co-authors of the report that I mentioned, Ricky and Kate at the University of Adelaide. Thank you to Planning and Land Use Services for funding me to do that work, the Conservation Council for setting the ball rolling, and to Blackwood Uniting Church for holding this event. I'd like just to leave you with this quote. A smart city is where humans, trees, birds and other animals can grow with all their glories, imperfections, freedom and creativity. They are not just cities of technology, but cities of love, life, beauty, dignity, freedom, and equality. They're imperfect places, but they're certainly better with trees. Thank you.
Stefan, thank you so much for your talk this afternoon. It has complemented so beautifully the talks that have preceded it today. I hope you've all enjoyed it. We've actually come to the end of the event, so what we're going to be doing is moving into the other area for a close very shortly. But before that, I'd just like to offer a small expression of our thanks to you for today, Stefan. Please join me again. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.